Back in 2014, I was using the app Uber a lot because I couldn't drive for a while due to some DUIs. It was just a dumb mistake on my part. There's a nightclub in my city that I used to go to with my friends on the weekends. We'd get a ride home if we had a designated driver, and sometimes we'd catch an Uber that night. I was feeling unwell and had to leave the club early in the morning. It was between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, and the temperature was too cold for me to walk home. I called for an Uber, and a man named Alex showed up. He was older and not smiling, and he had a gray goatee and a black beanie. He said he had a Chevrolet Malibu, which sounded nice, so I asked him to pick me up. I waited outside the club on a bench near the bouncer, who was standing motionless like a statue with his hands folded. Approximately 5 minutes later, the Chevy Malibu arrived in front of the club. I got out a bit grumpy because it was an old, worn-out car. The guy didn't say hi or honk, he just waited for me at the curb. I got in, and it was really uncomfortable. He wouldn't shake my hand or even look at me. All he said was, "Where are you going?" And then I gave him my address. We began to drive down Main Street, but in the incorrect direction of my residence. I informed him of this, and he directed us to turn left at the next intersection. We were now driving away from the main roads and into quieter residential areas. He had not entered my address into his phone, which made me feel uneasy. I was uncertain if he was expecting me to direct him. I decided to enter my address into my phone so he could listen in when the GPS said to turn left on the next street, but he had completely overlooked it. I made a puzzled hand gesture, and he noticed it and said, "I just need to make a quick stop. Don't worry, I'll give you a discount." Even though I was drunk, I still knew something was wrong. That's when I saw the handgun sticking out of his middle glove box beside him. Now I was trying to get out of the car at the next light. I tried the door handle very quietly, but it wouldn't open. I noticed that the child lock was on. From this point on, my heart was racing as the man drove as far as 2 towns away from my house. I couldn't just call the police because I wasn't sure what the guy would do, so I thought the best thing to do was try to flick the switch next to him on the front seat. I had to slip over to the back seat next to him without him noticing. It was one of the most intense moments of my whole life. I lost sight of his head in the rearview mirror, so I just slid in behind him casually. Fortunately, he didn't notice. Then came the worst part. I reached for the button up front at another red light before he could do a single thing. As we went through each intersection, I was feeling more and more tense as I waited for one of the lights to turn yellow. Finally, one did, and the car slowed down at a light that would normally be busy during the day. It was the perfect place to get away. The car stopped at a light that I knew wouldn't be very long, so I had to act fast. A car was stopped on the other side of the light, which made me feel a bit better. I reached up with all my might and touched the child lock button. I must have startled him because he leaped 2 inches out of the seat and yelled at me. Just as I thought he would, he reached for the gun next to him. I managed to unlock the door and escape to the nearby Cadillac Escalade, where I knocked on the windows for assistance. The driver of the Chevy Malibu drove off without responding, leaving me stranded. I then drove to a grocery store, which was open 24 hours a day, where I called for a taxi. This was a very disheartening experience, as I do not recall being intoxicated in the store or on the taxi ride home. I reported the incident to Uber, which informed me that the situation would escalate to the authorities. After a week, an officer arrived at my doorstep for questioning, but nothing further was heard from the officer. I have no recollection of the incident, but I have never used an Uber since. Back when I was 17, I was at a party, and everything was going great. But then the party host started getting really wild and creepy. It was around 3 a.m. and I was really drunk. So I called an Uber to try and avoid any advances from the guy. The Uber showed up, and I tried to calm down. When I got in the car, the driver started chatting up with me, and I didn't even notice the red flags. He started asking me questions about the party I was at, and I mentioned the creep. So he said it was because I looked short and cute. He asked me my age, and I felt a strange vibe from him, so I told him I was a minor. I thought that would stop him from making any more advances, but it turned out to be a bad idea. He was driving really fast on the highway, and I was really drunk. He asked me to go out with him that night and said he really liked me. I told him I would get grounded if I stayed out late, and that my mom was up and waiting for me. Remember, I was living in Mexico, and the number of people, especially women, who get murdered every day is really high. When we arrived at my home address, I noticed that the door was locked. He kept insisting that we go for a drink. Even though it was nearly 4 a.m., I was trying to be nice when I told him that I couldn't go out at night. He then asked me for a phone number and told me that he could go out with me the next day. This wasn't the first time he had asked me for a number. I gave him the number, but I changed the last number so that he couldn't actually call me. He then dialed my number as I was getting out of my car. My phone didn't ring, and he got upset and said that I gave him the wrong number. I played dumb and said my number again. But this time I said it right, so he'd think he heard the last number wrong. He laughed and told me it was his fault, saying he'd see me the next day. I got home and woke my mom up right away because I was so scared. She calmed me down and told me to sleep, so I went into my bedroom and was putting on my pajamas when my phone rang. It was the Uber driver trying to video call me, and I freaked out when I saw it on my screen. Upon receiving a text from an unfamiliar number, I denied the call. Subsequently, I noticed that the sender had sent me a total of 15 messages, asking when they could pick me up and asking why I was not responding. I blocked the sender immediately, expecting the situation to end. However, the following day, I received a text from the same number, and upon looking at the image, I realized it was the driver. He asked me why I had blocked him and began spamming me. I immediately blocked him. During the following month, I received messages from various phone numbers, and it became apparent that it was the driver I had always blocked. Eventually, I reported the driver on the Uber app and changed my phone number. The only issue is that the driver knows where I live.